And where we have the the unemployment gap in the Phillips curve, make a substitution from the Okun's law. Generalize all of that, and what we end up with is this equation. So notice that we have inflation equals expected inflation, the value from the previous year. Now it's plus gamma, some parameter, which by the way is a combination of beta and omega, times the output gap plus our price or supply shocks. Notice the key here is we've gone from an inverse relationship in the Phillips curve to a positive relationship in the short-run aggregate supply curve. This is the equation for our short-run aggregate supply curve. Inflation will equal the prior year's inflation. You can think about that as the starting point. Right? So if we want to figure out what inflation is this year, we start with whatever it was last year. That's our expectation. We add to it something that depends upon the output gap. Or maybe we subtract to it if this is negative. And then we would add or subtract something to that depending upon what kind of price shocks we might also be experiencing. So when we look at our short-run aggregate supply curve, we have a curve that looks something like this. Now, where the short-run curve intersects the long-run curve is quite important. So let's just call this intersection point pi naught. And what we want to ask is, what can we say about that particular inflation rate? The first thing that we want to recognize is that point, let me label that point A. Point A is on the long-run aggregate supply curve. If we are on the long-run aggregate supply curve, the natural rate, the actual unemployment rate, will equal the natural rate of unemployment. And from the accelerationist Phillips curve, inflation will not be changing. So if we actually are at point A, we'll see on Thursday, we may not be, but if we are, there's no reason for inflation to change. The second thing that we should note here, if we're on the long-run aggregate supply curve, our Phillips curve analysis says that actual inflation will equal expected inflation. Right? That's a long-run condition. Actual inflation equals expected inflation. So remember that the short-run aggregate supply curve depends upon expected inflation. So when we draw a short-run aggregate supply curve, we also want to be very explicit about showing what our expected inflation rate is. So for this short-run aggregate supply curve, the expected inflation rate must be pi naught. That's the only place where actual inflation and expected inflation are the same. That, however, does not mean that is actually what inflation is. We could be at some other point on the short-run aggregate supply curve. All that we know is that this is where actual inflation equals expected inflation. But we might be at point B, and we might be at point C. And you can see if we're at those points, inflation will be different than its expectations. Something needs to happen in that situation. And we'll be looking at that more closely on Thursday. Now, let's think about why the short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. So if we think about economic output rising, suppose there's been some increase, say, in government purchases or autonomous consumption, investment, net exports, whatever it might be. So economic output is rising. Demand in the economy is growing. We're moving up along our short-run aggregate supply curve. Notice that actual inflation is rising, but expected inflation is not, at least not in the same time period. So what that implies is for businesses, actual inflation says, oh, that's what I can sell my goods and services at. Say that's rising 5%. So I'm able to increase my prices by 5%, but I'm only expecting inflation to be, say, 3%. Right? Well, if I expect inflation to be 3%, pi naught, that's what I expect to increase the wages of my workers, to pay my vendors and other suppliers, to pay rent, electricity, blah, 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 all the kinds of things that a business needs to operate. But I'm seeing that I can raise my prices by 5%. So in this adaptive expectations process, one of the reasons businesses are willing to produce more is because, at least in the short run, they're fooled by what is happening to inflation. There's a difference between actual inflation and expected inflation. And it's that difference that will cause this economy to adjust. Again, something we'll see in much more detail both on Thursday and next Tuesday. Now, okay, if we go back to our equation here, we have this value of gamma, right, which shows how sensitive inflation is to various output gaps. What happens to the short-run aggregate supply curve as the value of gamma increases? Take that short-run aggregate supply curve. It has a positive slope. Increase gamma. Short-run aggregate supply curve gets steeper and steeper. As it continues to increase, it gets steeper and steeper until eventually the short-run curve becomes the long-run curve. As the short-run aggregate supply curve rises, increases, the value of gamma increases, and the short-run aggregate supply curve steepens, it would show us that inflation is becoming more sensitive to changes in the output gap, which implies that wages and prices are becoming more and more flexible. So now, small changes in economic output relative to potential would cause relatively large changes in inflation. If the value of gamma comes down, then the short-run aggregate supply curve will flatten. Any given output gap will now have less of an effect on inflation. Wages and prices have become more sticky. So the slope of the short-run aggregate supply curve, or for that matter, the slope of the short-run Phillips curve, the value of omega or the value of gamma, determines whether or not wages and prices are very flexible or very sticky or somewhere in between. Now recall, one of the big differences between classical economists and Keynesian economists is their view about how flexible wages and prices are. In general, classical economists will argue that the value of gamma is fairly high, wages and prices are fairly flexible. Keynesian economists would broadly argue, no, wages and prices are stickier than that, so the short-run aggregate supply curve is actually relatively flat, meaning that any given output gap is going to give you less pressure up or down on inflation. Well, how do we determine whether which of those two cases is true? Well, we could try to measure the values of gamma and the values of omega, and many people have tried that. Turns out to be very complex, and the data doesn't give you a definitive answer, unfortunately. Okay, where are we? Okay, now let's think about what would cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift. Now remember, the short-run aggregate supply curve has three factors in it. It has expected inflation, has the output gap, and it has price shocks in it. So any one of those three could cause inflation to change. So let's look at each one of them. So in this case, let's suppose that there's an increase in inflation expectations. So if the economy starts at point A, and then there is an increase in inflationary expectations, the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift up. Now, in this particular case, inflation expectations changed. So if we look at the intersection point of the short-run aggregate supply curve and the long-run aggregate supply curve, they intersect at pi 1. That's our new long-run equilibrium. So in this case, inflation expectations have also moved up to pi 1. So we end up, if we expect higher inflation, again, in the aggregate, what we're likely to get is higher inflation. If we all expect inflation to be higher, we change our behaviors in a way to bring it about. If workers expect higher inflation, they want higher wages. If business people expect higher inflation, they want to be able to raise their prices. But they also expect that their input costs, raw materials, other types of input costs, labor, all will go up 5%. If that's the general attitude, it's pretty likely that you're going to get 5% inflation. So that's what we've shown here. Now, a second thing that could happen is that there could be a price shock. So in this case, let's think about a big increase in, say, oil prices. So if crude oil prices go up, crude oil is used very broadly in the economy, so that's likely to lead to higher inflation. Once again, if we start at point A, we would see the short-run aggregate supply curve shift up. But now we need to think more clearly or closely about what's happened to expected inflation. Remember, we're assuming that expected inflation is formed in an adaptive process. So that inflation in year 1, subscript 1, will still equal inflation in year 0, pi naught, the prior year. So in this case, there has been no change in inflation expectations. So now we've got pi naught, pi naught. Notice in our previous, we had pi 1 and pi naught. In our first example, inflation expectations changed. In our second example, the price of oil changed. Now, it is true that expected inflation is going to change later, but not in this first time period. So we automatically have a shift in our short-run aggregate supply curve. The last thing that can cause the curve to shift is a positive, or is a output gap. It does not have to be positive. So let's suppose that we're at point B, not at A. So notice we're starting at a different point here than the previous two examples. And notice that we have a positive output gap. So what does our formula, our equation for our short-run aggregate supply curve tell us? So if we remember, inflation equals the inflation rate in the prior year plus gamma times the output gap plus any price shocks, and that expected inflation will equal actual inflation from the prior year. So notice here at year 1, while we're at point B, inflation is at pi 1. What are we expecting inflation to be in year 1? Well, we're on the short-run aggregate supply curve. As long as we're on this short-run aggregate supply curve, what we expect inflation to be is going to be where it intersects the long-run aggregate supply curve. So actual inflation, we're at pi 1, but we expect inflation to be pi 0. Actual inflation 5%, we expect it to be 3%. Oops, what's going to happen? What will happen the following year? The key to what happens the following year is how we set up adaptive expectations. So the following year, our expected inflation rate is now going to change. It was at pi naught. Now it's going to move up to pi 2. I'm sorry, it's going to move up to pi 1. So that means then that the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift up in year 2, and expected inflation will equal pi 1. So notice then, the first example we did was a direct change in inflationary expectations. This last example that we did is still a change in inflationary expectations, but it's a delayed change. It's a delayed change because of the output gap. the output gap causes actual inflation to deviate from expected inflation. Depends on what else is happening. So the question was, after it shifts, will we still be at Y1? And that requires other things to happen. Notice, like we did with our aggregate demand curve alone, I can't tell you what equilibrium is. Guess what? With an aggregate supply curve, or two alone, I can't tell you where equilibrium is. We need to put those two together, and then we'll find out where we end up, and how we end up where we actually do end up. But the key here is to recognize the short-run aggregate supply curve can change because of a direct change in inflationary expectations, a direct change in price or supply shocks, or a output gap that causes a delayed change in expected inflation. Again, we'll be going through all of these in much more detail, maybe agonizing detail for you, on Thursday and next Tuesday.